Forgotten Mine Shocker. Rick Ness unlocks a $190 million hidden gold pocket. Nobody in the Yukon believed Rick Ness had anything left. The equipment was worn down, the money was nearly gone, and the crew that had once trusted him, without question, was quietly starting to look elsewhere. But 30 seconds ago, deep underground, a scanner just picked up a signal so concentrated and so powerful that every single person in that war room stopped breathing. What Rick Ness is standing on top of right now could be worth $190 million, and the most terrifying part is that someone may have known it was there all along and deliberately walked away from it 40 years ago. The story of how Rick Ness arrived at this moment did not begin with a lucky break or a sudden stroke of inspiration. It began with failure, the kind that accumulates slowly over multiple seasons and starts to feel permanent. For anyone who has followed Yukon mining closely, the past few years of Rick's operation had been genuinely painful to watch. Season after season, the ground refused to cooperate. Equipment broke down at the worst possible moments. Fuel costs climbed while gold production stayed flat or dropped. The financial losses stacked up into figures that would have crushed most people entirely, and the whispers across the mining camps grew louder with every passing month. People who respected Rick, people who had watched him build his operation from the ground up, were beginning to use the past tense when they talked about him. His career was becoming a cautionary tale rather than an inspiration. What kept Rick going during that period was not optimism in any simple sense. It was something more stubborn than that, a refusal to accept that the ground had nothing left to offer him if he just kept looking in the right places. While other miners were focused on their own operations or writing Rick off entirely, he was doing something that most people in the industry rarely take the time for. He was going back through the historical record, reading old geological surveys, studying field reports from operations that had run and closed decades before he ever arrived in the Yukon, and looking for patterns that might have been missed or abandoned prematurely. It was in that process of quiet, determined research that Rick found the reference that would change everything. Buried inside a collection of old mining documents was a detailed survey report on a site that had been actively worked in the early 1980s before being shut down completely. The official record on the closure was brief and not particularly informative. The operation had been deemed financially unviable and the site was sealed. But the geological data attached to those same records told a far more interesting story. The surveys conducted before the shutdown had detected metallic readings at depth that the original operators had never fully investigated. The concentrations being measured were unusual, notably higher than what you would expect from standard placer gold deposits in the region, and they were coming from layers deep underground that the original drilling had only just begun to reach when the operation was terminated. What made the site especially interesting and especially intimidating was the additional information in those old records about the underground conditions. The geological reports described a subsurface environment that was genuinely complex and potentially dangerous. There were references to unstable formations at significant depth, to pressure anomalies that the original crew had encountered and could not fully explain, and to the presence of conditions that made continued deep drilling both technically difficult and risky. The combination of those factors, the financial pressure the operation was already under, and the challenging nature of the underground environment, appeared to have been enough to end the project permanently. For 40 years after that closure, the site sat untouched. The Yukon wilderness reclaimed the surface in the way it reclaims everything that humans abandoned there. The physical markers of the old operation faded and rusted. The site disappeared from active mining maps. A loose reputation developed around it among local miners, the kind of informal, passed-down knowledge that discourages people from taking a second look without ever fully explaining why. Nobody went back. Nobody tried. The gold signals, sitting in those old geological records, went unexamined for 4 decades, while the frozen ground above them stayed completely silent. Rick read all of that and made his decision. He was going in. Convincing investors to back an operation at a site with that kind of history was not straightforward. Rick had to present the geological data carefully, acknowledge the risks honestly, and make the case that the underground signals described in those old records represented a genuine opportunity that was worth the complexity and the cost of pursuing. Some people passed. Others, perhaps recognizing something in Rick's certainty, or simply willing to take a calculated risk on a miner with his track record despite the recent difficult seasons, came in. The financing that was assembled was substantial, reflecting both the scale of what the operation would require and the depth of what Rick believed might be waiting underground. The equipment mobilization alone was a major logistical undertaking. The remote location of the site meant that getting the necessary machinery into position required planning and resources that went well beyond what a typical Yukon mining operation demands. Heavy excavators capable of handling the kind of frozen, compacted material that deep Yukon sites present were transported in. Specialized drilling equipment designed for reaching significant depth was brought onto the site. A proper operational infrastructure was established, including the monitoring systems needed to track underground data continuously and the wash plant capacity to handle the volumes of material the operation would be processing. Keeping everything running required a fuel supply chain that operated almost constantly, with delivery after delivery, making the run out to the remote site to keep the machines working around the clock. Work began under conditions that tested the crew from the first day. The Yukon does not make anything easy, and a deep drilling operation targeting layers 140 feet or more below the surface introduces complications that surface mining simply does not face. The frozen ground at depth behaves differently than the material closer to the surface, and the equipment has to work harder against rock formations that have been compressed and solidified over geological time into densities that standard placer mining machinery is not always designed to handle. The early results were discouraging. Day after day, the drilling pushed deeper, and the material coming up was rock and frozen gravel with no meaningful gold content. The scanning equipment was not yet picking up the signals that the old records had described. Crew members who had signed on to the operation with some degree of hope started to look at each other during shift changes with expressions that did not need words. The skeptics who had said this site was a dead end were looking increasingly correct, and the money being spent to prove them wrong was accumulating quickly. Then the mechanical problems started. The rock formations deep underground turned out to be significantly harder than the surface geology had suggested they would be, and the drilling equipment took damage that required expensive and time-consuming repairs. A major breakdown in the primary drilling rig cost the operation a significant sum and forced a halt that nobody could afford. Additional equipment failures followed in the weeks after. Hydraulic systems gave out under the pressure of working against unusually dense underground material. Motors burned out. The cumulative cost of keeping the machinery functional was climbing toward figures that genuinely threatened the financial viability of the entire project before it had produced a single significant result. Rick held the operation together through those weeks through a combination of direct leadership and sheer persistence. He addressed the crew honestly about what they were facing, acknowledged that the conditions were harder than anyone had anticipated, and made clear that he was not walking away. His certainty about what the old geological data was pointing toward had not weakened, even as the surface evidence kept failing to confirm it. The crew, some of them veterans of difficult Yukon seasons themselves, responded to that steadiness in the way that experienced miners often respond to a leader who refuses to crack under pressure. They stayed. The night everything changed was not marked by any particular advance warning. The war room was running its standard overnight monitoring cycle, with engineers tracking the live data feeds from the underground scanning systems, while the drilling rigs continued their slow progress below. The data had been routine for hours. Standard readings, expected pressure levels, nothing that suggested what was about to appear on the monitors. Then one of the deep scanning systems registered an anomaly. The metallic density reading coming back from a specific location at significant depth was dramatically higher than anything the system had recorded since the operation began. The engineer monitoring that station looked at the number, looked again, and called the rest of the team over before saying anything. Moments later, a second independent scanning system locked onto the same location and returned the same reading. The two systems were confirming each other, and what they were both pointing at was a concentration of metallic material at depth that was simply not consistent with scattered placer gold deposits. The density levels were in a range that indicated something far more significant, a concentrated formation rather than a dispersed surface deposit, the kind of thing that forms through specific geological processes over vast periods of time and stays locked in place until something or someone reaches it. The war room was quiet for a long moment after the second confirmation came through. Everyone in that room understood what they were looking at. After the weeks of breakdowns and frustration and mounting costs, the scanners were now showing exactly what Rick had believed would be there based on those 40-year-old records. The signal was real. The deposit was real. The question of how large it was and how accessible it could be made was suddenly the most important question in the room. What followed was a period of intense and focused work. The entire operation shifted its attention to the anomaly zone, and the excavation effort was redirected to begin reaching the deposit level. The crew that had been grinding through discouraging days of zero results suddenly had something specific and concrete to work toward, and the atmosphere on site shifted accordingly. Exhaustion did not disappear, but it was now exhaustion with a clear purpose rather than exhaustion without any visible destination. The cleanup that eventually came from targeting the anomaly zone produced results that experienced Yukon miners described as genuinely remarkable. The material being processed by the wash plant was yielding gold in concentrations that stood out immediately from anything the operation had seen before. As the cleanup table was worked through and the recovered gold was weighed, the numbers coming off the scale climbed well past what even the more optimistic members of the crew had been hoping for. The gold was dense and heavily concentrated, with characteristics that the experts on site recognized as unusual. It did not match the profile of typical placer deposits, where gold is scattered through material in relatively diffuse patterns. This looked like something that had been collecting and concentrating in the same location over an enormous span of geological time, a deep formation rather than a surface migration deposit. The value represented by that single cleanup was enough to make even the most skeptical crew members reconsider their doubts. And the immediate consequence of the cleanup results was a new set of questions about what else might be sitting in the same underground system. If one targeted excavation in one section of the anomaly zone had produced those results, what did the full extent of the formation look like? The answer to that question required deeper scanning, and the data that came back from the more detailed underground mapping effort was both exciting and deeply unsettling. The original anomaly was not a single isolated pocket. The detailed scans were now revealing a pattern of connected underground structures, multiple distinct zones of high metallic density arranged in a configuration that suggested an extensive geological system rather than the simple concentrated deposit. The depth of these connected structures extended significantly below the initial anomaly, with the deeper readings pushing the total scale of what might be present underground well beyond the initial estimates. The figure that had been used in early calculations as a rough estimate of the deposit value was beginning to look potentially conservative. The connected nature of the underground system also created the most serious risk factor the operation had yet encountered. Cavity systems beneath the surface create instability that changes the physics of the ground above them in ways that are difficult to predict and manage. The pressure dynamics around connected underground cavities are complex, and the potential for sudden, large-scale ground movement increases significantly when those cavities are present at depth. The engineers tracking the underground monitoring data were now issuing warnings with a regularity and urgency that reflected the genuine danger of continuing to drill into an environment with those characteristics. To get a clearer picture of the underground conditions, the decision was made to deploy a specialized camera system into a borehole deep enough to actually see the formations the scans were mapping. It was a technically demanding operation that required careful management of both the camera equipment and the underground pressure environment during the descent. The footage that came back up in real time to the war room monitors was unlike anything the crew had seen from previous underground camera deployments at conventional sites. The rock walls visible in the early footage were rough and uneven in the way that naturally fractured underground formations typically appear. But as the camera descended further toward the depth where the anomaly signals were strongest, the character of the walls and the footage changed. The surfaces became smoother, more regular in their curvature, and under the camera's lighting system, metallic reflections began appearing across the walls in patterns that immediately caught the attention of everyone watching the monitor. Whatever was coating those underground surfaces was responding to the camera light in a way that was consistent with highly concentrated metallic material. The kind of concentration that the surface scans had been suggesting was present, but which was now being confirmed visually for the first time. Then the monitoring systems started alerting. Pressure readings around the camera's position began climbing toward levels that indicated ground instability. The camera footage itself began showing movement, small fragments of rock falling past the lens, subtle shifts in the wall surfaces that indicated the underground environment was responding to the presence of the borehole in ways that were moving toward dangerous territory. The decision to pull the camera back was made quickly, but before the retrieval was completed, the footage captured something that the entire room reacted to immediately. In the final seconds before the camera came back up, a large opening became visible below, an underground space that extended far beyond the range of the camera's light and confirmed that the connected cavity system the scans had been mapping was present and significant. That footage, combined with the cleanup results and the scanned data, spread through the Yukon mining community within days. The reaction it produced was notable precisely because Yukon miners are not an easily impressed group. These are people who have spent careers in difficult conditions, who have seen promising operations fail and modest-looking sites produce surprising results, and who have developed a healthy skepticism toward big claims and dramatic stories. But the specific, detailed nature of what was being described in Rick's operation, the cleanup numbers, the scan profiles, the underground camera footage, was not the kind of thing that experienced people in the industry could simply dismiss. Veteran miners who came to look at the data in person left with expressions that confirmed the results were genuinely outside the range of normal placer mining experience. The attention from the broader mining community brought both resources and pressure. Investors who had been watching cautiously from a distance became more actively interested. Geological experts who specialize in deep formation systems asked to study the underground mapping data. Media coverage of the operation increased significantly as the scope of what Rick had potentially found became more widely understood. All of that attention created a strange dual reality on the site itself, where the operation was becoming famous at exactly the moment when it was entering its most dangerous phase. Because the deeper the excavation pushed and the more detailed the underground mapping became, the clearer it became that the risk profile of the operation was climbing alongside the scale of the potential reward. The pressure data from the underground monitoring systems was showing instability that the engineers could not fully characterize or predict. Water was beginning to appear as a significant complicating factor, with underground water pressure building in ways that threatened to flood the lower excavation zones if the drilling hit a poorly positioned section. The probability that a major underground event, a collapse, a sudden pressure release, a rapid flooding of a lower chamber, could occur at any moment without sufficient warning had grown to a level that could no longer be managed simply through careful monitoring. Rick Ness was aware of all of it. He reviewed the risk assessments from his engineering team. He understood what the underground data was showing, and he made the decision to continue. His reasoning, stated plainly to his crew, was that discoveries of this scale do not happen without the willingness to accept extraordinary risk, and that walking away from what the scans were pointing toward, after everything the operation had already cost, was not something he was prepared to do. The crew, whatever their private concerns might have been, stayed with him. The deeper scanning data that continued coming in during this phase of the operation kept pushing the estimated scale of the underground system further than anyone had initially projected. The anomaly signals that had originally been concentrated in a specific depth range were now appearing at levels significantly below the initial discovery, with density readings in some of those deeper zones that matched or exceeded what had been found in the layer already successfully targeted. The geometric pattern of the connected system, as it was gradually being mapped through continued scanning, did not look like anything that resulted from the normal process of gold migrating downward through placer deposits over thousands of years. It looked like something older and more fundamental, a deep geological concentration that had been building since long before the Yukon surface took its current form. The total value sitting in that underground system, if the deeper zones proved as rich as the scan data was suggesting, was a figure that the initial $190 million estimate did not fully capture. Analysts who studied the available data were working with numbers that went significantly beyond that figure. Whether those estimates would hold up once actual extraction reached the deeper targets was a question that could only be answered by continuing to push forward. And so the operation continues. The drilling rigs that have been working this site around the clock are now targeting layers that no equipment has ever reached in this location. The war room monitors are streaming data continuously, updating the underground maps as new information comes in from each drilling pass. The engineering team is managing pressure readings and monitoring for the warning signs that would indicate an imminent ground event. The crew is working in conditions that are objectively more demanding and more dangerous than anything the Yukon typically asks of its miners. Rick Ness stands at the edge of this operation, knowing that he has already done something that most people in the mining world would not have attempted. He found something that had been sitting forgotten in a sealed-off site for 4 decades. He backed his own judgment against the accumulated skepticism of an entire community of experienced people. He kept his operation running through mechanical disasters and financial pressure and crude doubt that would have ended most mining projects long before they reached anything significant. And he pulled gold from the ground in concentrations that the most experienced miners in the Yukon described as unlike anything they had seen before.